Okay, hi everyone. Welcome. Very delighted to introduce today's guest lecturer, Dr. Khalil Andani. He is assistant professor of religion at Augustana College in Illinois, in the US. And uh, Professor Khalil Andani holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from Harvard University's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. And actually, that's how I know him. So we were both in graduate school at the same time at Harvard. So it's a pleasure to see him and to welcome him to our class here. And with that, I'll just turn over the floor to him because he actually has some cool stuff to share.
All right. Well, thank you so much to your kind professor. Yes, we go way back to graduate school, and I think we really got to know each other at a Halloween party where we were both in costume. I won't get into the details of that, but
I
it's
have no
true.
memory of this.
I think I have photo evidence. But anyway, that did not make it to the slides. So thank you so much for this kind invitation. It's an honor to be here and to do this guest lecture, especially because some of you obviously may not know this, but my training, my undergraduate training, is actually in mathematics, and I used to be an accountant. So I worked downtown Toronto at KPMG on Bay Street for several years as co-op student and full-time. But I always had a side interest in Islamic history and Islamic thought, which I just read up on for leisure. And what ended up happening is what was a side interest and a hobby became more of a passion, and I made a decision to change careers. So that was about 10 years ago. So I quit my accounting job on Bay Street and I enrolled as a non-degree mature student at University of Toronto, St. George, where you guys are. And I took courses for a year because I wanted to apply to grad schools. So one of the courses I took was this very course, NMC 273. So I've taken this course just like you guys have. And I guess I've now come full circle, and in fact, I'll just share that when I did take this course 10 years ago, at that time, the then professor uh, invited me to give the same guest lecture that you're getting today, believe it or not. Obviously, I've learned a lot since then, but I gave this talk 10 years ago in that class, so now I'm back. So I'm really thankful. It's very personally special to be with you today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share slides. So most of what you'll see is slides and a small head of mine. So hopefully that's okay. And I'm going to go for about an hour or 50 minutes. Now I'm happy if you raise your hand while I'm doing the lecture portion. That's totally fine. I will like call on you. That's if I see it. I should be able to. So I welcome you to do that. That's how I run my own classes, right? But I'll present for about 50 minutes or something. Some stuff I'll go over fast because it should be review or something like this. And then I'll open up for questions, and I can stick around till around for you 10:30-ish, give or take 5 minutes. So that's the plan. So let me do this. I'm used to using Zoom, so this is somewhat similar. So there, you should see my screen now. So once again, thank you for being here, and thank you to your kind professor for this invitation. So let's begin. What are we talking about? We're really going to focus on, well, overall, we're going to be talking about the Ismaili tradition of Islam. And if you're hearing background noises, I have two kids over here sort of tuning in as well. So we're talking about the Ismaili tradition of Islam. Our focus will be on the Fatimid Caliphate, the Fatimid Khilafah, both like the background to that, the historical background to the Fatimids, and a little bit about sort of what they did, and also the post-Fatimid development, which I will cover in brief, but I was specifically asked to speak a little bit about the post-Fatimid traditions, specifically the Nizari Ismaili tradition. So you'll hear about that too. And some stuff I'll go through fast, but we can go back to it in the Q&A if you'd like. So very quickly, just for some, old stuff that you may already know, but I just want to revisit it. So I just want to quickly look at the nature of authority when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran. The question being, what sort of authority did Muhammad possess? There is an impression today among modernists, among certain Salafis, and sometimes in certain textbooks, that the role of the Prophet Muhammad was nothing more than to recite the Quran, so to be the instrument of the revelation of the Quran and nothing else, that his authority didn't go beyond that. There is this popular impression of this today. And I want to begin by actually just pushing back against that. So if we consider the Quran as the earliest documentary source for the movement that Prophet Muhammad led, and most people do consider that, then the Quran paints a more expansive picture of the scope of Muhammad's authority. So I've sort of categorized these into, well, he has the function of being a prophet and messenger, which everybody sort of knows about. So the prophet is a warner. He's a bringer of good tidings. He warns the unbelievers of punishment, things like this. But in addition to that, in general, which we find more in the Medinan part of the Quran, we find the idea that Muhammad holds authority on God's behalf. So the judgment of Muhammad, the commands of Muhammad are basically seen, practically speaking, as the judgment and the command of God himself. And there are certain Quranic verses that paint that picture. Then in addition to that, you also have this notion where Muhammad is a teacher and a guide. So one of his functions that's repeated throughout the Quran is Muhammad is there to teach the contents of God's book and wisdom. And we should keep in mind that, and I won't get into all of it today, but if you're interested, I talk about it on my YouTube channel. The notion of book or kitab and hikmah, wisdom, in the Quran is not limited to the Quran. It's a far more expansive idea of divine guidance. But in either case, Muhammad's role is to be the teacher of the book and the wisdom. He's not just there to recite it. So he's an interpreter of revelation, a teacher of revelation, not merely a fax machine for revelation. And finally, Muhammad in the Quran also plays a role of intercessor. So intercessor as in a intermediary, a middleman of sorts between God and his community. Not only is this in the Quran, but there are some early first century, early second century inscriptions, like rock inscriptions, where some Muslim has evoked Muhammad as an intercessor. So Juan Cole's website, for example, has discussed these. So this is what we find in the earliest period. This is sort of like before when Muhammad is alive, before the Quran becomes a book. So some scholars like William Graham, they referred to this phenomenon of revelation in early Islam as a prophetic revelatory event. So this is a time where the Quran is oral, it's not written. And the prophetic guidance itself is also oral, ongoing, and responsive. So in general, Muhammad in his lifetime holds what you could call extra Quranic authority, right? He's doing much more than just relaying Quranic recitations. And this is not a theological argument that I'm making. Whether one is a Muslim or a non-Muslim, the Quranic text interpreted historically supports this idea of Muhammad's authority. And this is important because it has broad effects on how Muslims in the post-prophetic era will think about authority, will think about succession and things like this. Now, another way to sort of look at Muhammad's authority, and I won't spend too much time on it, but there is this idea where he seems to function on earth as God's agent. This is more of a biblical term, but I think it applies here. He's God's agent and viceroy, basically. So there are certain verses that say something that's done in regard to God, something that's done in regard to Muhammad, it counts as something done in regard to God. You find this in the Quran. Some of the verses I've put on the screen for you. There are other verses which seem to speak of God and his messenger, in quotes, as functioning as one entity, not one ontological entity, but one authority in terms of agency, for example. So there are many verses like this. And I'm not the only scholar who's made this observation. There are several before me who've made this observation. But this I think is very, very significant that this is going on. And again, it affects what happens after Muhammad. The question that this raises is there anyone after Muhammad who, although they may not be a prophet, they could still function as God's agent or God's viceroy? You know, the one term for that would be Khalifa, right? So this raises all these questions about Khilafah and Imama after Muhammad. What would be the scope of the Imam Caliph's authority? So that's why I'm putting this here. Now, a little bit of review for you. You will all be familiar by now, I think, with the Sunni Muslim understanding of the succession to Muhammad, according to the Sunnis, and this view takes some time to develop, by the way. It's not really there at the beginning, but according to the Sunnis, while Muhammad's authority is acknowledged, he did not appoint a successor. And that means, really, for Sunnis, the Muslim community as a whole holds the authority to select a caliph. So, or caliph, as they say. And eventually the Sunnis reached this position that there were 4 rightly guided khulafa or caliphs. This is only crystallized, though, by the 10th century, and I'll show you an example of this. Now, in actual history, and I'm sure you've read about this, right? You had the Medinan Ansar, the Medinan companions of Muhammad. After his death, they met at a place called Saqifa. Abu Bakr and Omar heard about this meeting, and they basically, I mean, to put it in layman's terms, Abu Bakr and Omar party crashed this meeting. And there was a debate that ensued about who should be the leader. I won't go into the details, but eventually this group, through persuasion and some duress, based on the reports we have, eventually they agreed on Abu Bakr as the Khalifa, Caliph, successor to Muhammad. Interestingly, Muhammad's family members were not present at that meeting. Nevertheless, Abu Bakr was proclaimed as the first caliph. And then, you know, after he dies, or upon his deathbed, he appoints Umar. Omar appoints a selection committee. Before he dies, they select Uthman. And after Uthman's assassination, in the midst of chaos, the community, many people in the community just requested Ali to be the 4th caliph. When Ali dies, Hassan actually is the 5th caliph for a few months. He has to abdicate that because his army turns against him. So he abdicates to Muawiyah. So really following Ali and Hassan, the Khilafah or the Caliphate, it basically becomes the possession of the strongest dynastic family. So we have the Umayyad caliphs, the Abbasid caliphs. You guys have heard about these groups already. The Fatimids are then part of that narrative, and we'll talk about them. But you have the Fatimids. So now what you have is the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and the Fatimids. For some period, they all coexist. There's 3 of them. They're at war with each other. You have competing caliphates. And then there's an Abbasid caliphate with the Mamluks under the Mamluks. This is after the Mongol invasion, and then the Ottomans, and the Sunni caliphate comes to an end with the Ottomans. So this is sort of just a summary. It's not really my focus, but this is part of the context of what we're talking about. So let's sort of shift over, and again, for the Sunnis, in the view of the Sunnis, the first 4 are rightly guided, but the Sunnis were duty bound to accept the authority of these other caliphates. You know, they basically still accepted them. The Fatimids, of course, were contested, but you had many Sunnis in the Fatimid domain who did accept them as their caliphs. And you had actually some people outside the Fatimid domain who saw them as caliphs as well. But the Sunnis generally agree that the Imam Caliph office is necessary, it must exist. It is broadly established by God, but the community is the group that selects the Caliph. And that's how it plays out in history. So now let's shift over a little bit to Shiism. And again, a little bit of this will be review for you. So you already have a group existing in the lifetime of Ali, who sees Ali ibn Abi Talib, and that he is Muhammad's first cousin, and he's Muhammad's son-in-law, right? He married Muhammad's daughter Fatima. So there's already a group that sees him. It's a small group, but they see him as the legatee or successor, wasi, of the spiritual and political authority of Muhammad. And this early group, known as the Shi'at Ali, in the next century, so in the 2nd century, they will evolve. A lot of them will sort of evolve into another group known as the Imami Shia, who have a more developed belief in this. And the Imami Shia, they trace the leadership of Ali. They call that the Imamate or the Imama. They trace the leadership of Ali through his lineal descendants, namely Imams, leaders descended from Al-Hussein. And we'll go through the details of that. What is the Quranic basis for this view in general? There actually is a Quranic basis for this. People can interpret the Quran in many ways, but one way of looking at this issue, and scholars like Wilfred Madelung and Amir Moizi have talked about this, there seems to be a Quranic precedent for the idea of family-based hereditary authority in the succession to various prophets. So there are many examples of this. I'm not going to go through the actual Quranic verses, but I've cited them on the screen for you. So we do have many cases in the Quran of God appointing imams, in the sense of leaders, among prophets and among the families and descendants of prophets. And these are just some of those familial lineages. And what one could do is, if you use the Bible as a source for this sort of historical worldview, you could actually draw up a genealogy like this. So in the biblical genealogy, Adam, Noah, Abraham are all direct descendants of one another. And then from Abraham, you have Ishmael and Isaac, which is also in the Quran. From Isaac, many of the Israelite prophets are descended, including Moses and Jesus. And from Ishmael, again, this is more of a sacred history. From Ishmael, you actually have the Prophet Muhammad, right? So Prophet Muhammad descends from Ishmael, and Ali, as the first cousin of Muhammad, also descends from Ishmael because they have the same grandfather. And the group who the Shia will recognize as the Imams, descended from Ali and Fatima, they are part of this lineage. So this was always one argument that was brought to bear, that the Quran paints this picture of prophetic, hereditary, familial succession. And there are specific Quranic verses that revere the family of Muhammad. So they were known as the Ahlul Bayt. There's more specific Shi'i focused material about Ali in particular that's worth noting. So again, I'm just summarizing it for you. I'm not really going to go through it, but you even have reports in the biographies of Muhammad, known as Sirah, where Muhammad appoints Ali at the beginning of his mission. There's a declaration that Ali will be his successor. Then there are a few hadith which you find in the Sunni collections that speak to a special position of Ali. The final example of this would be the tradition of Ghadir Qum, which I think you perhaps have heard about in this class already, where Muhammad says, "He whose Mola I am, Ali is his Mola." This is very much attested in the Sunni literature. I think there's about 110 companions who've narrated the tradition of Ghadir Qum. There's also the famous tradition of Hadith al-Thaqalain, where Muhammad says, "I'm leaving behind two things for you, the Kitab Allah, the Book of God, and my progeny, my Ahlul Bayt," which is also present in the Sunni collection. So this is sort of like the raw material, right? This is the material from early Muslim tradition, from the Quran, that the Shia would interpret, focus on, and they understood all of this as indicating that there is a divinely ordained succession to Muhammad. It begins with Ali as Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, and it continues among the descendants of Ali. So this is sort of like the preliminaries. In the lifetime of Ali, some of the research that's been done has found that indeed there was a group of people who expressed certain allegiance, loyalty, faith in Ali that was very similar to people's loyalty and devotion to the Prophet. So the term for that expression of loyalty and devotion to Ali was called walaya in the earliest period, and there's a whole research that's been done on this. And from this book by Maria Massi de Cake, I've just pulled up a few quotes for you to show this, where for some of these people, Ali represented for many of them an absolute and divinely guided leader who could demand of them the same kind of loyalty that would have been expected for the Prophet. So you do have this sense in Ali's lifetime that there was a group of people who basically believed that he was guided by God. And they believed that if you were following Ali and Ali's guidance and commands, then you were on the right path. You were on the path ordained by God. So in this sense, what we call Shiism is not just a political position, because this devotion is not merely a political devotion, right? Shiism, or what you could call proto-Shiism, it is a religious position that is there in the first century, basically. This is important to note because there are people who think that Shiism is simply a political ideology of sorts that morphed into something religious later. I would respectfully disagree with such people. So this is what you have in the early period. And just if we zoom out now, this is a genealogy, sort of the genealogies that come from Muhammad. You can see here that you have Muhammad, Fatima, his daughter Ali, their sons are Hassan and Hussein, you know, and there are then lineages of authority that come out of both Hassan and Hussein. They are the sons of Ali, but there are also claims to authority coming out from Al-Abbas, that's Muhammad's uncle. And if you choose, it's sort of like snakes and ladders. So if you pick a name and you follow it through to the bottom, you end up with a different group, a different caliphate, a different line of imams. So the Abbasid caliphs, they descend from Muhammad's cousin Abbas. The imams of the Twelvers and the Ismailis, they descend from Hussein, the son of Ali. You also had a Hassanid line of authority that's coming this way through Abdullah al-Mahd, through Muhammad al-Nafs al-Zakiya. So even there are later rulers that trace their line back to the Prophet, the Fatimid caliphs being one of those. So this is important to note, and at some point, these groups, these claimants, they were all rivaling one another. So there was a rivalry between the Abbasid caliphs, the Imams from Hussein, that's here. So what we call the Imami Shia, they basically follow this line: Muhammad, Ali, Hassan Hussein, Zain al-Abidin, who's the son of Hussein, Muhammad al-Baqir, Jafar Sadiq. The group that follows this line, they're known as the Imami Shia. But this line is being rivaled by all these other families. So that's what's important to know. We're talking now during the 700s, right? This is during the 700s. So if we focus in on that period, and I mentioned them, you have a group known as the Imami Shia. And by the 700s, they already have a unique identity, a ritual and communal identity, the Imami Shia. And who are the Imami Shia? They follow as Imams these descendants of Imam al-Hussein. So again, you go back to the thing over here, right? So the Imami Shia, they believe that Ali is the successor of Muhammad, then Hassan and Hussein are the successors of Ali, so they are Imams after Ali. Then Zain al-Abidin is the Imam after Hussein, Muhammad al-Baqir after Zayn al-Abidin, and then Jafar Sadiq. So this is what the Imami Shia follow. So a little bit more about them. So you have Muhammad al-Baqir. This is supposed to be a portrait of him. And he is also revered by Sunnis. So he's a Shia Imam, but he's also revered by Sunnis. And then you have Jafar Sadiq. He is a Shia Imam, but he too is revered by Sunnis as well, the Sufis as well. So both of these figures, although they are revered as Imams by their followers, they have a larger following too. Many legal scholars, hadith narrators, mystics, philosophers, they are among the following of these two figures, Muhammad al-Baqir, Jafar Sadiq. But what's very interesting for our purposes is that Muhammad al-Baqir and Jafar Sadiq claimed to be divinely appointed, divinely guided, purified imams of the Ahlul Bayt, which means the family of Muhammad. So they made this claim. This is a claim to authority. And it's important to note that while these two imams of the Shia make this claim, the Abbasids and Umayyads make similar claims. So you have the Umayyad, the lifetime of Imam al-Baqir. The Umayyads are the caliphs. The Umayyads also claim to be divinely appointed. So there is this general idea that is very popular at this time, that leaders are appointed by God and leaders are guided by God. So there's this sort of intra-Muslim debate going on. And this is a quote from Jafar Sadiq. And if you read the quote, I won't go through it, but if you read it, he basically says, my speech is identical to that of my father. And he says that is identical to his father, which is identical all the way back to the speech of the Prophet, which is identical to the word of God. So if you look at this quote, Imam Jafar Sadiq is basically saying that his own speech, his guidance, is identical or equivalent in authority to the word of God, which is to say the Imams are claiming to guide and speak on behalf of God. They're claiming to have divine authority of some sort. So this is what you find again, this is we're now in the 700s, right? The late 700s, you could say. So these two Imams, al-Baqir and Sadiq, they claim to be the rightful successors of the Prophet and Ali, and they often quoted the Quran to make this case. And again, I'm not going to go through their actual commentaries, but we have material from them where they've cited several Quranic verses where a group is mentioned, and they've basically said, this group, i.e. the Ulul Amr, the possessors of God's command, that refers to the Imams. Or the light which God has sent down, that refers to the Imams. So you find this in Shia sources even today. So a summary of what they claimed was that the Imam, the leader of the Muslim community, is divinely appointed. He's not chosen by consultation. So God appoints each Imam, and that appointment is manifested when one Imam, every Imam, appoints his own successor from among his children. So that appointment is called Nas, and it's seen to be a divine appointment. It's not really a human appointment. The second idea that they have is the Imam is the speaking Quran. So the Quran as a book is not sufficient as guidance for Muslims. That's what they taught. The Imam said that the Quran does not work by itself. It must be accompanied by a teacher or an interpreter who is infallible, and that would be the Imam from the family of the Prophet. They also claimed that their knowledge by which they function as Imams, that their knowledge is inspired by God, that God inspires, God grants knowledge to the Imam through a form of spiritual inspiration. And due to that, the Imams are protected from sin. So this is also part of this doctrine. And some of these Imams also taught that before this world was created, God created Prophet Muhammad and the Imams in the form of a spiritual light. So there is a pre-existent spiritual light that God creates before the physical world, and that is the light of the Prophet, that is the light of the Imams. So this is also part of that teaching. Now, if I zoom out a little bit, because we're here just talking about one group, right? This is the beliefs of the Imami Shia. So if we zoom out a little bit, we could ask this question, what else is going on at this time? So we tend to talk about Sunni versus Shia as if these two big groups have always existed since the Prophet died, but the reality is something more like this. So you have a group called the Shia Ali who, right after Muhammad, believe in Ali. But you also have the Kharijis who do not accept Ali or Muawiyah. They don't even like Uthman. You also have the Uthmanis who believed in Uthman, the third caliph, but they don't believe in Ali. And then you have the Murji'is who believe in the first two caliphs. They're not really sure about Ali and Muawiyah. You may have heard these groups already, but you have a lot of different schismatic groups early on. In the next generation, you have the Imami Shia, but you have the Umayyads who recognize the Umayyads as God's caliphs. You have a group called the Ahl al-Ray. Abu Hanifa is most often the example of them. They believe that you can use reason and analogy to interpret the Quran and Sunnah. And then you have a group called the Ahl al-Hadith, who prioritize the literal meaning of the Quran and the Sunnah as recorded in Hadith. And what's interesting is that the Ahl al-Hadith, they are a group that recognizes Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman as caliphs, and they also push for Ali to be recognized as the fourth caliph. Whereas you can see there are these other groups that don't really agree on Ali as the fourth caliph, like the Umayyads and the Uthmanis. It's actually the Ahl al-Hadith who took that position. And what will happen is, now you also have the Mu'tazilis, and maybe you've heard of them as well, who have a preference for Ali, but they don't see him as divinely appointed. What will happen over time is that a lot of these groups will get consolidated, and they will negotiate. They'll develop they will evolve, and there'll be a consolidation negotiation. And a lot of these groups, by between the 11th to 13th century, these groups, not the Kharijis, but these groups here, they will become what we call the Sunnis, the Ahl al-Sunnah. But this is a consolidation, and that consolidation is not reached until really the 11th century at the earliest. Some would push it back further to the 12th or 13th century. One thing that I would point out is that one reason why this Sunni consolidation even happens is because they want to put up a united front against the Fatimid Ismaili Shia. Right, so that's very important. So there is a political element as to why this even happened. So it's only really, you can only talk about the Sunnis as a unified body really in the 11th century onward. You can't really talk about the Sunnis as a unified body in the 700s or the 800s, and not even the 900s. So if we now talk about the Shia, what happened among the Shia? Now we're looking just at this group, right, and what happens to them. So I have depicted it on this chart. So the black here is the Sunnis, which we've talked about. This is the Shia, and you have these are the Imams of the Shia that you see on the screen here. And after Jafar Sadiq, the Shia themselves will split into different groups. Okay, so this is a schism now among the Shia, and this can get quite complicated. But the major schism is between the Ismaili Shia and the Twelver Shia. All right, that's the major schism. And what happened there? And I'm going to go through this quickly. You don't really need to know all the fine details because this is a matter of history, but you need to know that there was a split off after Jafar Sadiq passes away. Now, why did this happen? Well, most historical sources that we have tell us that Jafar Sadiq, because he was the Imam, before his death, he appointed his son Ismail to be the successor of the Imamate. Okay, so he appointed Ismail as the next Imam. This is something that most of the earlier sources, agree on. And most modern scholars agree that this happened as well. And I'm just quoting one of them for you. All right. So this should have been a neat and tidy affair. What should have happened is when Imam Jafar Sadiq dies, the community should have followed his son Ismail as the next Imam. However, by most accounts, Ismail, the appointed successor, died before Imam Jafar Sadiq. So now this created a question among the Shia Muslims. Who's the next Imam? Because the actual appointment was for Ismail. So Paul Walker, who has studied this, is a scholar of Shiism, he tells us that the appointment of Ismail, that was historical, theologically speaking, what that means is that Imam Jafar, his appointment of his son was God's choice. So it's actually God, if you take this theologically, God chose Ismail to be the Imam. And many Shia could not believe that this choice was a mistake. So Ismail dies before his father, and nevertheless, some people said, well, the appointment must still be true. And it seems, yeah, as your professor said, right? So the designated successor appears to die before his father. So this is a problem. So this led to a theological debate. Well, is this appointment still valid, or is another son to be the Imam? And who would that be? And it seems, historically speaking, that the Imam Jafar did not appoint someone else. So one group said that, well, if this is the designation, if it's Ismail, then even if Ismail has died, the Imamat lineage must continue in the descendants of Ismail. That was one theological interpretation of this issue, because this was a big issue, right? If the Imam Jafar's choice is God's choice, like who should be the next Imam? Well, it should be Ismail. But Ismail, again, most sources say he died. There's a minority sources that say he did not die. Some of the sources contradict themselves. So some sources say Ismail died, and then they also say Ismail was seen 3 days later in another city. So some people believe that he did not really die, that maybe his death was staged. Now, you may ask, well, why would anybody stage the death of their son? One reason why people accept that it was a staged death is the Abbasid caliphs were attempting to put an end to the line of Imamat anyway, so that staging the death of his son Ismail was a way to get the Abbasids off the trail of the line of Imam. So if the Abbasids thought Ismail is dead, then they won't be searching for him and trying to kill him, basically. So what ends up happening is Imam Jafar Sadiq passes away because Ismail is not there. Even if he's alive, he's not in Medina. So the Imam passes away, and there are actually 6 groups that emerge when he dies. So each group recognizes a different person as the Imam after Jafar Sadiq. 2 of these groups believe either in Ismail. So one group still says Ismail is alive, and they say, we're waiting for him, he's the Imam. And another group, which is more subtle, they said, well, if Ismail did die, we can accept that, but then his son, so Ismail's son would be the next Imam. Whereas another group, known as the Musawi, they followed a different son, Musa Kazim, as the Imam. So what we call the Ismailis, and they didn't call themselves this, but the groups that we call the Ismailis, they're highlighted. They basically will follow Ismail and Ismail's son as the Imams. So Ismail did have a son, Muhammad, so Muhammad bin Ismail. That son existed. He survived in either case. He got out of Medina because of Abbasid persecution, but he survived. And there was a group that continued to trace the Imama in the progeny of Muhammad bin Ismail. So we have that. So this group would be the earliest Ismaili group. We don't know much about them, but we just know that they were there, that we know that they existed. And again, if you're confused, we can try to simplify it for you. So after Jafar Sadiq, you have a group that follows Ismail, and you have a group that follows Musa Kazim. Now, eventually, most of the Shia at that time follow Ismail's brother, Musa Kazim. And this group will follow Imams from the line of Musa Kazim until the 12th Imam. So the 12th Imam of the line of Musa Kazim, the 12th Imam in total, he disappeared as a child. His father died in 874, and this 12th Imam has not been seen since really 874. So the group that follows this line are called the Twelver Shia. Today, they're the majority of Shia. So the majority of the Shia in Iran and Iraq, Pakistan, Bahrain, and all these places are Twelvers. There's about 200 million Twelver Shia today, and they still believe in the 12th Imam. The minority of the Shia at that time followed Ismail, and they followed Muhammad bin Ismail, so as Imams. And Muhammad bin Ismail had progeny as well. We have their names here. But what's interesting is that these three Imams, after Muhammad bin Ismail, so they are seen as Imams by the Ismailis, they were concealed from the public. But their existence is documented in historical sources. So even Sunni sources, the sources that are very anti-Ismaili, everybody admits that these three individuals existed, that they were the leaders of a wide Ismaili movement that was, doing dawah around the Muslim world. So people all agree that they existed, but we don't know specific biodata about them. And what will happen is that the Fatimid caliphs, the first Fatimid caliph, Al-Mahdi, he is the son of, he's the descendant of these Ismaili Imams, basically. So this is sort of where the Fatimids come from. And there is a debate over, so again, everyone agrees that these three generations of Imams existed, okay, the ones that I've italicized here. But there was a debate in the sources over, well, who really are they? Like, who are they? Are they really descended from Ismail, or are they imposters? It's agreed, though, that the Fatimids come from these leaders, right? The Fatimids come from this family. So while these Imams are concealed, they are not inactive. They're actually quite busy. So they are the leaders of a dawah, okay, a summons. This dawah is a movement. It is a movement that is preaching and teaching. It's basically getting converts. So it is a dawah that's spread throughout the Muslim world, and it's successful in several places, but it is a secretive dawah. It is, some scholars have said that the Ismaili dawah of the 9th century basically looks like a Sufi order with a political dimension to it. That's what some people have said. So this dawah is doing stuff very secretly. Why? Because they were persecuted. So if people knew that you were part of this Ismaili dawah, the Abbasids would execute you or torture you or something like that. But it was there. So you have this very active dawah, and the leaders of that dawah are those three concealed Ismaili Imams. And there was actually a hierarchy, and I won't go through the details, but the idea is that you have this sort of spiritual hierarchy of teachers, and you see the Imam is number 3 here, and under the Imam there are ranks of teachers. So the people who are actually doing the preaching and the teaching, the esoteric initiation, the Imam is not doing that in person because they're sort of running for their lives all the time. But it's these other ranks, the Hujjah, the Dais, they're the ones conducting the dawah on behalf of the Imam. So this is a historical fact. The sources record that this dawah existed, and it was being led by these Ismaili Imams who were actually based in Salamiya at this time. Now, there's a debate in medieval Muslim thought over who were these concealed Imams. In other words, who are the ancestors of the Fatimids? Right? Like, what family do they come from? So you have different sources. So in Ismaili writings, which is from the late 800s onward, it is very clearly said that the Fatimids and their ancestors are the direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad through the lineage of Ja'far Sadiq. This is very clear in all the Ismaili sources that we have, some of which are quite early. It was also declared publicly when the Fatimid Caliphate was established, because they called themselves, Fatimiyya, for example. So you have that. Ismaili sources are quite clear on who this family is. Now, you also have, Salamiyya is in Syria, as your professor has said. Now, you also have, in the 10th century, so in the 900s, a long tradition of anti-Ismaili polemic and propaganda. Okay, so you have a bunch of authors who are pro-Abbasid, and they start saying that no, the Fatimid ancestors are Zoroastrians. Now, no evidence, of course, was offered for this, but this is sort of part of the polemic, to call somebody a Zoroastrian or a dualist or whatever. So that was a story that was concocted, and if you study this, it's like a snowball story. It looks like a game of broken telephone, in a sense. So you have a polemic against the Fatimids, and based on that polemic, in the year 1011, the Abbasids actually issue a document called the Baghdad Manifesto, and in there, they say the Fatimids are the descendants of a Jewish magician. Again, no real evidence is provided, but this was a good propaganda document, so they went with it. Interestingly, the Fatimids, the dynasty rises in 909, but the propaganda of Baghdad starts in the year 1000. So they only do it when the Fatimids threaten the Abbasids, politically speaking. What the question that one would ask is, who should we, who's trustworthy here? Like, if you're a modern scholar today, who should you follow? Should you take the polemics as historical? Would you take the Baghdad Manifesto as historical truth, or would you trust the Ismaili sources? And what a lot of people have not noticed is that there happen to be a number of Sunni scholars and Sunni historians, so not Ismaili, who do affirm the Fatimid Imam Caliphs as descended from Imam Jafar Sadiq. And a lot of people have just forgotten about this, but you have this. So in my work, I've tried to collect the names and the references. So firstly, people may not be familiar. There's always a group in Muslim society called the Ashraf. The Ashraf are people who are descendants of the Prophet, descendants of Hassan and Hussein. So they're called the Ashraf. They're not Imams, they're not Shia Imams, but they are descendants of Hassan and Hussein. So the Ashraf of Egypt and the Ashraf of Mecca and Medina, believe it or not, they affirmed that the Fatimids are the descendants of the Prophet. They said the Fatimids are from the same family as them. So there's actually a declaration by the Meccan Sharif at that time who affirmed the Fatimid lineage. The Buyid Amir Aduda Dawla, in written correspondence, he acknowledged the descent, the prophetic lineage of the Fatimids. The Twelver Shia scholar, who's also a Sharif, Sharif Aradi, he recited a poem against the Abbasid Caliph, and he said that the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt is from the same family as him. You also have a number of Sunni historians, so these are not Ismailis, but Sunni historians who defended or agreed that the Fatimids are descended from Imam Jafar Sadiq. So it's important to note as well, and the modern scholar should really look at all the evidence instead of focusing on just one or two of these narratives. So this is just important to note. But there was a medieval debate about this, so I just want to point that out, and I'll leave it up to you guys whether you think Ismaili writings, polemics, Abbasid propaganda, or other medieval historians. I'll leave it up to you to decide who you think is more credible, but it's just important to note. I want to give you one example of this. There's a good question here. Do contemporary sources, let me bring up the chat here, discuss the risks? Yes, so this is a very good point, right? Now, when many dynasties come to power, they never publish their genealogy. Like, nobody does that. The Abbasids did not publish a genealogy when they came. The Safavids did not either. So the Fatimids didn't publish any genealogy, and one reason why they wouldn't have done that is that it would probably endanger a lot of people, right? A lot of people would figure out who was helping the ancestors of the Fatimids come to power. It would put a lot of communities at risk. So there were very good reasons not to publish any genealogy. It was around 100 years after they rose, they started talking more about their genealogy in certain sources, but you don't have this public sort of display. Oh, this is our genealogy, because it would put them at risk. But there is a, you know, based on the sources we have, we can trace that genealogy. So going back to that slide I had, those three names of those three ancestors from Muhammad bin Ismail, they appear in all the sources that we have. I want to give you an example from Ibn Khaldun. So Ibn Khaldun, famous Muslim historian, he's not an Ismaili, of course, but he has a section in his Muqaddimah, which is, and I'm using Rosenthal's translation. This is also posted on the blog of my friend Muhammad Balan. I actually copy pasted right off the blog because it's just easier for formatting. So Ibn Khaldun, in his text, he's writing much later, and I'm not going to read it to you. I've just highlighted here important parts. He defends the genealogy of the Fatimids. He says they are descended from Ali and Muhammad. And Ibn Khaldun attacks everybody who tries to discredit their genealogy. And he says this is this propaganda is based on stories that were made up to favor the weak Abbasid caliphs, right? That's what Ibn Khaldun says. He says these Abbasids and Umayyads were threatened by the Fatimids. And he says nobody would take the Fatimids seriously if they did not have a valid genealogical claim. If the Fatimids were frauds, Ibn Khaldun says, then they would not have been as successful as they had, and none of these other dynasties would have cared about them. Everybody would have just said, well, we know you're a faker, so like, who cares about you? But that's not what happened. The Fatimids actually were able to present themselves and act in the world as if they were real descendants of the Prophet. And for Ibn Khaldun, that is part of the proof that they are authentic. He also notes that the Baghdad Manifesto was basically propaganda. Right, Ibn Khaldun says that you know, it was done under duress and this based on hearsay. So that's from Ibn Khaldun. And so Muslim historians who affirm the Fatimid lineage were basically acting as source critics when they defended the lineage, and they attacked some of these other pro-Abbasid writers who were basically doing propaganda on behalf of their own dynasty. Now, modern scholars also debate this, and again, I'm not going to go through every opinion, but to summarize it for you, everybody in yellow highlight affirms the Fatimid genealogy to different degrees. Those who are in blue or blue-green, I'm colorblind, I don't know what color this is, but the other color, these are scholars, modern scholars, who think the Fatimid genealogy is false. So you have this diversity in modern scholarship. Now, the pattern that I've seen, and I'm putting myself here, because I have a PhD now, so I can now list myself as a modern scholar, I think. So I've given my own opinion on this as well in two of my writings. But basically, the question comes down to this. Are the anti-Ismaili polemics reliable? Should we trust anti-Ismaili polemical sources over Ismaili sources and over some of those medieval historians? It all comes down to that. It comes down to what sources are reliable and what sources are not reliable. And then you sort of make a judgment, you know, on that. How does the minority opinion affect the belief of modern Ismailis? Most modern Ismailis today have full confidence in the genealogy of their Imams, but let me tell you why that is. So one issue is that if you go back to the 10th century or the 11th century or maybe the 12th century, do we think that Ismailis had all these genealogies that they were combing over, and that's why they believed in the Imams? No, they didn't. Why did Ismailis believe in it? And one thing I found is that, you know, the Ismailis accepted the genealogy of their Imams partly because of a theological argument. So one of those theological arguments is provided by the Dai, Hamid ad-Din Kermani. He's a Fatimid Dai. So the Fatimid Dais had such confidence in the genealogy of the caliphs that the Fatimid Dais tried to convert non-Ismaili rulers all over the Abbasid territory. So the genealogy could not have been problematic if they really believed they could convert Buyid and Abbasid generals and stuff to their cause. So Kirmani makes this argument, and what he does is that he uses the Quran and the Hadith and reason just to prove the idea of a divinely ordained imamat. Okay, so he makes a theological argument that there is an imamat that always exists in the world, and then he uses a little bit of history and says, look, if there really is an imamat, there has to be an imam. And Imam Jafar designated Ismail. So Kirmani says that regardless of how much history that we know about, there must be in the world hereditary imams from Ismail's descendants, because we know that much. That's sort of the argument that he gave. So for Kirmani, the question is, if you know that there is a hereditary imam from the lineage of Ismail in the world, we just have to find out who he is. And so that was Kirmani's argument. I've quoted from his text here. But that's basically him making this argument, that if the Imamat of Ismail is established fact, then he had to have progeny. You know, if Imam Jafar Sadiq designated Ismail, and if Ismail had a son and successor, you know, that if Ismail did not have a successor, then he would not have been designated as the Imam. So this is a theological argument. But the way it ends up is this. The only claimant to the Ismaili Imamat, i.e. the only Imam who claims descent from Ismail, who claims to be an Imam, is the Fatimid Imam Caliphate when Kirmani was writing. And he was not being challenged by any other claimant. And therefore, Kirmani said, we know that these Fatimid Caliphs, we know that they're the Imams, and we don't actually have to textually verify their genealogy, because they're the only ones who even meet the criteria of being these divinely ordained imams. So this is a theological argument, but it's basically the argument that Ismailis in the medieval era would use, because nobody had access to all this genealogical tables and stuff like this. So the Fatimids, they rise in 909. They rise because there is an expectation of a Mahdi, a messianic figure from the descendants of Muhammad. Everybody was waiting for such a figure to come. The Twelvers were waiting. So the Fatimids believed that the Imam of their lineage, that he was that promised Mahdi. And I won't go into the details. Give me a second. I have a hungry kid here. I won't go into the details of that. But the Fatimid state begins in North Africa due to dawah, to a successful dawah operation. So you have a Fatimid Dai who basically converts communities in North Africa, the Berbers, and that's when the Fatimid dynasty begins. And the Abdullah al-Mahdi, who descends from that Ismaili line of Imams, he is proclaimed as the first caliph in 909 or 910. This is a text of his first sort of sermon or message upon acceding to the office, to the office of caliph. So we have this. We have a whole text called "Founding the Fatimid State," which documents how the Fatimids came to power. And this here is the Fatimid Empire in pink by the year 1000. So they're in pink. They have Mecca and Medina. They're encroaching on the Abbasid territory. The Buyids at this time are ruling over the Abbasids. So you have the Fatimid Shia, the Buyid Shia, the Samanids as well. The Hamdanids are also Shia. So this is also known as the Shi'i century, for example. So this is sort of the height of Fatimid power. And this is a quote from Bernard Lewis, when Bernard Lewis used to make, what we would call good scholarship, before he sort of turned around on things. But Bernard Lewis makes this sort of intriguing point that, the Fatimid Caliph, he represents the emergence of a new power that is young, fresh, and vigorous. And what's very unique about the Fatimid Caliph is that he's not only a Caliph, he's also an Imam. So the Fatimid Caliph is also seen by his followers as a divinely ordained Imam, the embodiment of God's guidance and purpose on earth, right? So this makes the whole Fatimid dynasty unique, because they're not just claiming political authority, they're claiming spiritual authority as well. Now, some of the things that they accomplished, and they accomplished a whole lot. They conquered Egypt. They built the city of Cairo. They created Al-Azhar, which by some great irony is the center of Sunni learning, but Al-Azhar used to be a center of Fatimid Shi'i scholarship. They also promoted science and art. So even at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, you can find examples of Fatimid art. They ruled over Mecca and Medina, and when they were the rulers of the two holy places, the Kaaba was adorned in white, not black, that we see today, right? So that's an important thing. Sort of imagine what that would have looked like at that time. And again, I'm just summarizing. There's entire books written about Fatimid accomplishments. So a good book by Heinz Halm, The Fatimids and Their Traditions of Learning, will go into details about this, both the religious scholarship and the scientific scholarship. One example for you. So the Fatimids, when they were in North Africa, they were enforcing Shi'i rituals and Shi'i law, known as Madhab Ahl Bayt. That was in North Africa. But then when they go to Egypt, they have a different policy. So when they go to Egypt, two things happen. First, they do develop their own fiqh. So Fatimid Ismaili fiqh, i.e. Islamic law for the Fatimids, is based on 7 pillars of Islam, not 5 pillars. But even when the Fatimids enter Egypt, they issue a guarantee, an aman. And what that means is they allow all the Sunni madhabs, the Sunni forms of Islamic law, to practice their own faith, to practice their own interpretation. So we have this text that was issued by the Fatimid Imam Caliph Al-Mu'izz, where he says to the population of Egypt, you will continue in your own madhab. So this is religious freedom for the Sunnis, right? And religious freedom for the Jews and Christians. So this is actually a hallmark of Fatimid policy, that they allowed the Sunni majority in their territory to continue practicing Sunni Muslim ritual and Sunni Muslim theology. The Fatimids never tried to force convert anybody in their empire to Ismaili Islam. Now, that's sort of at the public end. If you look in the private realm, you have the Fatimids who are still conducting a dawah, right? A dawah. So there's still an Ismaili dawah network in Fatimid Egypt and also all over the Muslim world. So you have these Sunni theologians that maybe some of you have heard of. You also have these Ismaili dais. And I don't have the time to sort of go into the details of this, but the vision of Islam, theological vision of Islam that you find in Ismaili Islam from these dais, from the Fatimid dais and thereafter, is very, very different. Ismaili theology and Ismaili cosmology is very different from what we today call mainstream Islamic theology and cosmology. The Ismaili view of what is a prophet, the Ismaili view of revelation, is very different from what we today call the majority / mainstream Muslim understanding. And we can come back to this in a few minutes when we do Q&A, but I'll just sort of mark it there for you. So anyway, that's sort of like a summary of the Fatimids. And there is, of course, you know, this is the peak of the Fatimids. This is in the 11th century, first half of the 11th century. Look, they're very close. They have Syria. They're very close to Baghdad here, right? They actually did take Baghdad. I think it was 1059 or 58. They did take over Baghdad through a proxy. So this is them at their peak. But by the end of the 11th century, the Seljuks have come. There's been a lot of anti-Fatimid propaganda in the Abbasid world. The Abbasids are being revived, so the Fatimids are really pushed back by the end of the 11th century. And what's going to happen is, with this Fatimid Caliph, Al-Mustansir, these are all the Fatimid Caliphs right here, from the 1st to the 18th Imam, the 8th Caliph, 18th Imam here. There is a schism. So there's another disagreement on who the next Imam is, and that leads to 2 rival lines of Imams. One is descended from Nizar, the Nizaris, and the other is from Nizar's brother, Musta'ali. They're known as the Musta'lians or the Tayyibis. The Musta'ilin Imams by number 21, that the whole line of Imam goes into hiding. So they are not present in the world anymore. They're represented by another type of religious authority. So you have this split after the Fatimids, two lines of Imams. So you have two different Ismaili communities, the Nizaris and the Musta'ilin-Tayyibis. Here's just another way to sort of depict this. So without going through the details, because I don't have the time today, but the Nizari Imamate continues from the end of the Fatimid era, another 29 generations. So to make a very long story short, the Nizari Imamate will continue. It will go to Persia. It will go to Iran. There'll be a Nizari state in Iran, but the Mongols will destroy that state. The Mongols attempted a genocide of the Nizari Ismailis. They tried to wipe out the line of Nizari Imams. They were not successful. So the Nizari Imams, after the Mongols, they survive. And the Nizari Ismaili communities survive. They practiced taqiyya for about 500 years, basically. And that doesn't mean that nobody heard from them. It just means that it's very difficult to trace what they're doing, because they will appear publicly as Sunnis or Twelvers or Sufis. But the 46th Imam, so now we're many generations later, so the 46th Imam, what we find is he sort of comes out more into the public, the 46th Imam of the Nizaris, and he's known as Aga Khan. He's given this title Aga Khan. And then his grandson, who's the 48th Imam, and we have pictures of them, he is Aga Khan III. So the Aga Khan title only starts with the 46th Imam, and now every Imam holds the Aga Khan title. So you have Aga Khan III, who's here, and he brings the Nizaris into the public limelight. He's a very well-known figure. He was the president of the League of Nations, believe it or not. And his successor is the 49th Imam, Shakrim al-Husseini Aga Khan IV. And that is the present Imam of the Nizari Ismailis. And we actually have, information on that whole genealogy, which I've put. So starting from the end of the Fatimids, there's a whole documented genealogy of the Nizari Imams all the way to the present Imam, Shakrim al-Husseini Aga Khan IV. So this is actually very well documented. I would actually say that of any Sayyid or Sharif genealogy that is claimed today, this is probably the best documented one, because there's all this third-party, academic, primary, secondary source documentation for this genealogy. Now, certainly some generations in this genealogy are less well documented, and the reason for that is because out of 49 Imams here, 11 of these Imams were killed. 3 Imams thought to be killed. 1 Imam survived an assassination attempt. 8 Imams faced the threat of being killed, and 18 Imams of the 49 were heavily persecuted. So what that tells us is, out of 49 Nizari Ismaili Imams from the beginning, starting from Ali to the present, 44 of them have lived in danger. That's 88%. So this is, to put it differently, the Nizari lineage of Imams has always been an endangered species of sorts. So obviously, if you're trying to historically track this line, you will find some generations where these Imams are trying to hide. They don't want to be discovered. But despite that, it's a very well-documented lineage. So the present Imam, who you must have heard of if you're in Canada, that is the 49th Imam, and he's known as Aga Khan IV. His name is Imam Shakrim al-Husseini. And he runs the Aga Khan Development Network, and he interprets Islam like for his community today. So the group today known as just the Ismailis, they're Nizari Ismailis, they follow the Aga Khan as the Imam. And he has publicly interpreted Islam in what many call a rather progressive and modern way. And the Aga Khan is he's very decorated as a figure. He's been honored. So, for example, he's an honorary citizen of Canada. He's also a recipient of the Order of Canada, which is the highest honor in the country. This is him with Jean Chrétien, for example. So he's quite well known, especially in this country. There are many Aga Khan projects in Canada. So there's an Aga Khan museum not too far from you, right? There's a Ismaili Center. There's a delegation of the Ismaili Imamate in Ottawa. So you have a lot of Aga Khan Ismaili projects in Canada. So the Aga Khan himself, he has invested about $400 million into establishing and constructing museums, parks, and gardens in Canada, right? About $400 million. So he runs today a network called the Aga Khan Development Network. They spend almost $1 billion per year in humanitarian development. And this network, it basically is premised on the ethics of Islam. So this Aga Khan Development Network is one of the ways that the present Imam of the Ismailis, it's one of the ways that he interprets Islam publicly, right? The Imam believes that it's part of Islam, it's a requirement of Islam to basically raise the quality of life for human beings. And that's what this Aga Khan Development Network does. So we often hear today about only violent things associated with Islam and Muslims, and then war and violence. Shh. Okay, 1 second. War and violence is associated with Muslims all the time, but we seldom hear about projects like this where humanitarian development is associated with Islam. And the Aga Khan is not the only one who does this, but it's important to note that this work is done in the name of Islam. It's not done as a side charity project, for example. Now, today, the Aga Khan, he plays different roles in different realms. So if you only read tabloids, tabloid media, and increasingly mainstream media, they will only talk about the Aga Khan's personal and private activities. So he's also a businessman. He is a wealthy person. He has, his own sort of inherited family wealth because his family goes back many, many generations. So the Aga Khan owns businesses, for example. He's a world-famous horse breeder. Horse breeding, of course, being a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad himself. The Aga Khan is well connected. So you only hear about that. You read mainstream media, but most of the Aga Khan's time, 90% of his time, is spent running the Aga Khan Development Network, and giving speeches at universities and major institutions where he's talked a lot about pluralism, for example. Then there's also, in sort of the religious realm, the Aga Khan as the Imam plays a lot of spiritual roles for the Ismaili community, right? So he gives guidance to the Ismailis. He serves as an intercessor between the believers and God, just like the Prophet did for his community. The Imam receives the zakah, or the sadaqah, the religious dues, and he's the one in charge of putting them to the correct use. So he interprets Islam, and he gives spiritual guidance for the Ismailis as well. On top of all these things, we just never hear about his religious functions. We hear more about his public functions, but nevertheless, that's there. So I think at this point, I will conclude my portion. I sort of went longer than I had hoped, but I can stick around, I could say, for about 20 minutes, and I can stick around and I can take questions, comments, whatever you'd like. So thank you so much. I hope this was informative. And again, I tried to cover a lot, from Fatimids all the way to, the year 2021. So there's a lot going on, and I've just given you a summary. So if you go to my YouTube channel, you'll find more videos where I go into more details about some of these topics. But I can take any questions, comments, whatever you'd like. All right.
Great.
So
Thank you. So there's one question so far from Sarman. Yeah.
Yep. Yes. It's a great question. So Ta'wil refers to the esoteric or spiritual interpretation of the Quran. Historically speaking, and I can actually backtrack to one of my slides here. So if we go back to an earlier slide, just find it for us here. So historically speaking, the Imam, while he is seen as the source of Ta'wil, in practice, the people who wrote Ta'wil in books, who explicated it as a teaching, were these individuals under the Imam. So the Bab, the Hujjah, and the Dai, these are spiritual ranks under the Imam. The Ta'wil would often be heard from them. So we do have the works in translation of some of these people. So Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yemen, he was at the rank right under the Imam. We have his Ta'wils. It's in Arabic, and some of it is translated, so we can read it. Nasir al-Khusru, he was the rank of Hujjah. We have his Ta'wil. So in actual practice, while the authority of Ta'wil lies with the Imam, the actual Ta'wil in and of itself, in the sense of something that you could read that comments on the Quran, that is coming from these Ismaili Dawa ranks. And if you Google some of these names, you will find primary and secondary sources where you can read about this Ta'wil. The only problem is that we have not really cataloged this, so I'm actually trying to put together a project to create a database of Ismaili Ta'wil, because Ismailis, they didn't compose tafsir. So you don't have a book that starts with Quran chapter 1 and goes all the way to the end. Rather, in any Ismaili writing, it could be about cosmology, Quranic commentary will be embedded in there on selected verses. So that the Ta'wil exists, but it's spread through so many different texts. And what I'm looking to do, if there's any tech people who want to help out, I want to actually put together like a crowdsourced database, so we could bring a lot of this stuff together.
Great. Any other questions about any of the aspects of today's discussion? The one observation I'll make, I think you did a good job showing how sort of like basically, in our course, because it is a course in early Islamic history, right? Of course, broadly defined, the whole sort of aim is to understand the first few centuries that kind of determine the long-term history of Islam, but at the same time, how there's sort of a range of possibilities, and I think that often we back project later developments, and we see that, oh, like this is how, right, the normative or whatever, but actually in the early centuries, the norm was being debated between different sections of the Muslim community, and I think that that's you did a great job highlighting that. I think that's kind of interesting. Another question from Sarmad, but also others, please, anything that's unclear. There's a lot that was there today. Anything that's unclear, anything that you'd be interested in more clarification on, please, questions welcome.
This is a great question, theological dissent. So I'm actually going to put up another slide. It's in another slideshow. So is theological dissent possible? So here's what we do find. We do find that throughout history, different Ismaili theologians and philosophers, I had a whole bunch of names on the screen, they were permitted to interpret and formulate the theological principles in their own way. So what we find is that there are certain core principles that there is no dissent about. So Tawheed, prophethood, Imamat, everybody had to affirm these like in a creedal way. But the Ismailis were allowed to have creative intellectual engagement in how to explain what all of this means. So in most cases, you actually do have differences between one Ismaili thinker and his contemporaries on the explanation of these things. So we have this great quote from Hamid ibn Kirmani. So he is a Fatimid Dai. He's writing in the early 1000s, the early thousands. And he says something very interesting. He says that, the sciences of religion are too numerous to be comprehended by any one person other than the Imam, which is to say that an individual theologian, like himself, Kirmani, or any other Ismaili Dai, it is admitted that no one person could master everything. So there is this acceptance, according to Kirmani, that you can have theological differences among these Ismaili thinkers as long as the essential principles are the same. So everyone believes in the Ismaili Imamat, everybody believes in the oneness of God, but if you read how they talk about, well, what is the metaphysical status of the Imam, or how do we articulate the concept of Tawheed, how many celestial intellects exist in the spiritual world, there will be differences among the Ismaili Dais themselves, and it seems that that difference was okay. So rather than using the term dissent, see, dissent implies that there's like dissent implies that there's a uniform sort of doctrine and everyone has to subscribe. I think there are certain principles that are the same. So you could say there's a uniform creed in one sense, but the theologies are not the same. So instead of dissent, I would rather say that you do have diverse theology. You have the acceptance of diverse theologies, but those theologies are still bounded by some fundamental beliefs, if that makes sense. It's a good question, though. Is this contemporaneous with Abbasid discourse? Yes. So I can go back to one of those slides. I had like a timeline slide, right? So I can do that. All right, I always have the wrong PowerPoint is up, but let me find it. Yeah, so we do have a if I go back to our little timeline, I can show it to you. All right, so here, and we're skipping forward a bit here. We go to here. So these are these Fatimid Ismaili Dais right here in the blue. These are the Fatimid Caliphs. So they are contemporary, as you can see here. They are contemporary with many of the major Sunni theologians. So the Kalam tradition, the Falsafa tradition, Ibn Sina, it's all contemporary with all of this. The court of Ma'mun is earlier than some of this. So Ma'mun's court and what was going on there is earlier. It's about a century earlier. But really, Sunni theology is still in its early phase in the 900s. So Sunni theology and Ismaili theology, they're developing at the same time, and they're developing in conversation with one another. So that's also very important to note, that there is no real orthodoxy at this time. Everything is still up for grabs. So there's a debate. If you read carefully, Baqillani writes a text against the Ismailis, Ghazali writes a text against the Ismailis, Kirmani writes against the Sunnis. Nasser Khusro and others after him will be writing against Ibn Sina. So there's actually like an intellectual dialogue taking place, but it's not always very nice. So someone like Ghazali was hired by the Abbasid Caliph to refute the Ismailis, and Ghazali says in his book called the Infamies of the Batiniya, Ghazali says that the Ismailis should be executed, basically. I mean, that's the position that he takes. So it's not friendly, but there isn't. The point is that Ghazali saw the Ismailis as a serious contender to claiming truth, to the point where I've written an article on this. Ghazali, in his later writings, there is strong evidence that he actually agreed with some Ismaili beliefs. What did he agree with? He agreed with some Ismaili cosmology and prophetology. And there is strong evidence that I've presented in one of my papers published that Ghazali incorporated some Ismaili cosmology and prophetology into his esoteric writings that we have, such as Ghazali wrote a book called the Mishkat al-Anwar. So in that text, you find this sort of, there's an Ismaili imprint in that text.
Could you speak a little bit about the Ikhwan as-Safa, or the Brethren of Purity? I think that's something it's important to know.
So the Ikhwan as-Safa are this group based in Baghdad. They're an anonymous group, so nobody knows who they really are. and they produce an encyclopedia of 52 epistles, very large encyclopedia, and in that encyclopedia they're presenting like a total integrated worldview. So beginning with sort of, no, this is not the order of the epistles, but the worldview. Like it begins with theology. It's also Neoplatonic. So there's like God, and then there's like the universal intellect, the universal soul, prime matter. Like it's this very integrated philosophical worldview. But they also talk about all the religious sciences and all the rational sciences. So it's all in their work, and they talk about Imamat as well. So you do have this speculation that the Ikhwana Safa are Ismaili of some sort. They could have preceded the Fatimids. They could have been contemporary with the Fatimids. And there's a debate among scholarship on how Ismaili they are, but the same doctrines that are taught by these Ismaili dais are found, a lot of that is found in the Ikhwana Safa. How does esotericism influence Ismaili theology, even though rationalism plays a big role in it? Very good question. So the Ismaili view, esotericism and rationalism, is this, that the Imam is the recipient of divine inspiration. That's what the Ismailis believe. But the Ismailis also said that every human being receives a little bit of divine inspiration as well. So the human intellect is defined by these Ismailis as a glimmer or a weak form of divine inspiration. So there's a continuity between the human intellect and the divine inspired knowledge that is given to the Imam and to the Prophet. Therefore, Ismailis believe that with the guidance of the Imam, a believer can attain to these esoteric hidden mysteries behind the Quran, behind Islamic ritual, and behind the cosmos, that everything is sort of a code for a higher level of meaning. So Ismailis believe that everybody could attain this, and the Imam is the one who will guide people to that, often through the dais. And there's also this sense of spiritual practice, that the goal is not just to become very informed or learned. The ultimate goal is to merge your own soul with the universal soul. The universal soul being one of these celestial creations of God in the higher world. So that's what's going on. What structures did the Fatimid Caliphate create that allowed for their architectural scientific achievements? Well, there's a good book by Jennifer Pruitt about Fatimid architecture. I would refer you to that. She talks about all the different structures that were created, from mosques to institutions of learning to houses of science like the Dar al-Hikmah. I don't really have the details, but her book is very good. And Heinz Holm's book, The Fatimids and Their Traditions of Learning, is very good for that too. Any other questions?
I think we have a question from Sarmat. Yeah, go ahead.
So in theology, it says that it transcends all attributes, like talking about God, and then it says in esotericism, Imam reflects God's names. Like, isn't this a contradiction?
No, it's a good question. It's because I couldn't put the details on the slide, but basically, the Ismailis believe that God transcends all the names and attributes, and what we call God's names, right? Those exist at the level of the universal intellect and the universal soul. So basically, what we call God's names in common language, the Ismailis say that those are actually created. Of course, they're created at the highest level, but they're actually created by God, and those names exist at the universal intellect and soul. And so the Imam, as a human, he reflects those names at the level of the universal intellect and the universal soul. But it's a good question, and I haven't really talked about this theology today. I've only summarized it for you.
So this is different from like the Jahmiyyah, that like in Abbasid period.
It is different. It's different from them, but there are some commonalities between the Jahmiyyah and Ismaili theology. It seems like a lot of these theologies were inspired by Neoplatonism, right? or these other traditions. So a lot of Jaham bin Safwan's teachings are similar. He believes God is absolutely simple. I believe he also negates attributes from God, but Jaham does not seem to put the names of God anywhere else. As far as I know, the Ismailis knew that you still need to figure out where the divine names go, so they put them at the level of the intellect and the soul. And this is not very different from what Ibn Arabi will do. Right, so Ibn Arabi, famous Sufi mystic, he says God's essence is beyond names. Everyone in the Ibn Arabi school believes this. So the Sufis in general, they will also place the divine names at a lower level than God's essence. But the Ismailis seem to be one of the first groups to really do this explicitly. But it's a very good question, though.
So Ismailis, like, they ascribe motion to God, like, because in Asharism, God is not ascribed motion. So how does this work in Ismailism?
Did you say motion or emotion?
Yeah, just like ascribing motion to God, like
motion.
Yeah.
Like change, movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Ismailis would say God that you cannot ascribe motion to God. So God does not change. God is not physical. God, he's not a body. Nor is he a spirit. He transcends all of that. He's just pure oneness. So none of those things apply to God. Even cause and effect, God cannot be a cause, nor can he be an effect. The Ismailis negate all of the divine names and all of the metaphysical categories from God. So God is not a substance. God is not a thing. God is not a being. It's even wrong to say that God exists, because we exist too. So God has to transcend the type of existence that everything else has. So the Ismailis would say God is beyond existence and non-existence. The Asharis don't go that far. For the Asharis, God still exists. And for the Asharis, God has 8 eternal attributes, like knowledge, will, power. Honestly, I could do a whole other session on this if you had a theology course. For the Asharis, God does have eternal attributes, but he doesn't have any material qualities. The Ismailis go a step further. They say God does not have any material qualities, but God does not have any spiritual qualities either. There's just this sort of absolute, infinite, unitary divine reality, and that's it. So there's no limits to that. There's no multiplicity. I hate to cut this short, but I have to actually get going.
Yeah, thank you for your time. I know you stayed well beyond your commitment. So thank you again, Khalil. I hope that was interesting for everyone. Learned a lot. So yeah, thank you. And
you're welcome.
We'll get chances to invite you back to University of Toronto, your alma mater.
Okay, thank you so much. It was great to be with you all, and thank you so much for the questions.